So I will jump straight into the next panel. My name is Cristina Caffara. I'm an antitrust economist. I come from Europe. I no longer work as a consultant, but my disclosures are that when I was a consultant, I did work on a number of large cases, including for and against big tech players. I'm especially thrilled to be on this panel. This is a great opportunity. It was great to hear from Gail and from Andrew earlier, and Oren, of course. We are going to shift with this panel to what is happening in Europe. Certainly momentous in many dimensions. I'm very honored to have Andreas Mundt, whom everyone knows, is the president of the cartel office in Germany, as well as the president of the ICN. So very much a leading figure in antitrust enforcement in Europe. And of course, I'm equally delighted to have Roger Rolford. He was recently sworn as the principal deputy AG in the DOJ. We go back a long way because we have been alongside on the ATE case in Texas and more besides. So this is relevant because, of course, under Trump 1, Roger was head of international, and therefore he is very familiar with the European landscape and the scene. So let me start by setting the scene a little bit, and bear with me, because this is not just an ordinary time in Europe. It's an extraordinary time. I think what I'd like to just start with is that it's remarkable what we heard in the previous panel. In many ways, for someone who comes from Europe, there wasn't that much difference in many of the things that were being said in the previous panel and some of the approach of the previous administration, which is, of course, this realignment notion, which to Europeans is something we need to really come to terms with. The reality, though, in Europe is that while starting under Trump 1 and then under Biden, there was a great big rethinking about this sort of the philosophy of antitrust, what we're doing with antitrust, the whole critique of the neoliberal movement, the post-neoliberal discussion, the whole shift around away from consumer towards citizen, the appreciation of workers, the abandonment of efficiency as the lodestar, all of that, which we've seen happen in the US, culminating with the Biden administration, that conversation was not very live in Europe. Europe has kind of continued in the last few years in a way that is in many ways conventional and steady, continuing to enforce in the way it always pretty much did, without much change and much shift. However, there are two big vectors of change that I think now are significant and may affect materially the way in which the steady she goes conventional way that the European Commission in particular sort of adopts is going forward. So what are these two vectors of change? And I think they're relevant, the key to this conversation. The first one, of course, many of you, no European can have failed to hear about of the Draghi report. This is a big event, a report written by a former prime minister of Italy that fell with a thud on the desk of the European policymakers early September, and essentially said in a very stark way what we know as European. We knew, we should have known, of course we knew, but he was articulating it in a very stark way that our economic model, our social and economic contract is simply not sustainable in Europe. Europe is in a real crisis moment. Our whole economic model premised on exports is going to fail in the face of the challenges from China, in the face of the fact that America is stopping to be the importer of last resort. We have suppressed our own internal wages. America's superpower is the consumer market. In Europe, our consumer market is depressed and not really turning. So that economic reality is very much one thing that has stared at politicians in the face. We become the regulatory superpower. How will that help us? And then the second equally stark vector of change, and I'll get to the questions in a moment, but just to set the scene, is very much, of course, the change in administration and, realistically, the very clear realization in Europe that we can no longer rely on the protection and support of the United States and need to get our act together. So these two are really two, you cannot move in Europe for discussion around this at this point. Even the discussion around antitrust, of course, needs to really absorb this. So let's start with you, Andreas. There is and there has been an inevitable discussion in Europe about how does the antitrust enforcement piece fit with what we call the Draghi mission. There is a big imperative to grow, for Europe to come out of its doldrums, to actually start the engine, turning the engine of economic growth, because we have no alternative, because we need to do it. And so in that discussion, the favorite position of antitrust enforcers was, well, it's nothing to do with me. I'm not doing growth. It's for over there. These are other economic policy. I really don't have any role to play. But that is coming under strain because people are saying, are you sure? Are you sure as antitrust enforcer you don't really play much of a role? What can you do to aid the mission? Hiding in the silo and say, I do competition is no longer acceptable. So why don't you just describe a little bit the discussion? And I know you're very involved in it.
Thank you very much, Christina. First, I would like to contradict you. To be frank, I did never ever find that Europe is applying competition law in a conventional manner. I mean, if you look at what has happened over not only the last 4 years, maybe, but if you look at, let's say, a decade back, I mean, where did the innovation come from in for example, in enforcement of competition law in digital markets? I don't really think, I mean, I am in the US, but I would not say it came from the US. It came from Europe. The new tools that we have at hand, the ideas to tackle digital markets, to assess data-driven market power, to assess data-driven business models, to take into account data as one of the elements and factors that produce market power. That came even from Bonn, that did not even come from Brussels. And to be frank, I found that very innovative and all but conventional, just my first thing. The other thing is, I would never say, as the head of a competition agency, that I have nothing to do with growth. I would never say that I have nothing to do with competitiveness. But what I would say is, if I take care for competition, which is my mission by law, by the policymakers, I would say, if I do that, I contribute to both growth and competitiveness, because that goes hand in hand. You will never, ever get to competitiveness without competition. Why is a company successful? Because it has good products at a low price up to time, which means they have been innovative over time. That is the result of competition. What does it take to be competitive? You need a good product at a low price that is up to its task. So that has been innovative. And having said that, I do believe that we as competition agencies over the last years, especially in Europe, I'm only talking about Europe, we have done a good job in fostering competition and at the same time in fostering competitiveness. I'm absolutely sure that this goes hand in hand. There's just the recent report by DG Comp on protection of competition in a changing world, which says exactly that, that markets have been concentrating all over the world, in the US a bit more, or by far more, however you read that, than in Europe. And I take for myself that this is also the result of the fact that we have applied competition law in a very substantial manner. You referred to the Draghi report, which is all about competitiveness. There's some strange misconception. Many people who read the Draghi report afterwards say, oh, you have to loosen merger control. That is not a part of the Draghi report. It refers to the loosening of merger control only with regard to the telecom sector. And here I don't agree with Draghi at all. But this is the only part where you find something about loosening the rules on merger in the merger regime, and you find nothing else. And I think this is a good signal also for the European Commission that Draghi exactly does not mention that. Despite that, we have this debate, of course, on European champions. That is no debate. We have it again and again and again and again. But I would say if we want to have European champions, if we want to regain competitiveness, I think it's not our task as competition authorities to do our homework. I firmly believe we have done our homework in applying competition law in a consequent and stringent manner. If we talk about competitiveness in Europe, we should talk about energy prices. We should talk about bureaucracy. We should talk about regulation. As far as I know, Germany is the only country worldwide where the temperature of the restroom in a company is regulated. I do not know at which temperature, but we have regulation on that. I'm not telling you this because this is doing any harm. No, this is not doing any harm. But it shows to which extent we have regulated in Germany, in Europe. And I firmly believe if regulation would bring growth, I'm pretty sure Europe would be the most competitive area worldwide. But this is not the case, obviously. So I think this is the task we need to do. We need to look at the general framework for the economy in Europe. Maybe I come from Germany. I have always been an ordo-liberal in a certain sense, referring to a successful state in economic terms is a state that sets the framework for the economy and lets the economy play its game as free as possible. And this is how the German Wirtschaftswunder, the miracle of the German economy after World War II, had been set up. By the way, with the help of the US, who gave us a competition law, who took care that we have a competition agency. And maybe we should go a little bit back in Europe to this ordo-liberal thinking of a state that sets the rules, that puts in place a strong referee, a competition agency, and that tries to avoid bureaucracy, regulation to a certain extent in order to make markets work. And if you ask me, this is exactly what the European Commission is about to do. With whatever success. And there is, of course, the question how far this is going to go and if this is going far enough. But I firmly believe this is the aim also of the new tenure of Ursula von der Leyen. And we will see how far this takes us. But I think the principles to which we must go back are clear, and they're also clear to all the policymakers in Europe.
Not that
And you will say that is too optimistic.
not that I'm saying for the chair to disagree with the panelists, but I will anyway, in part. So let me just distinguish a little bit what you pointed to the early move, and I'll shift and transition to Roger in a second. You pointed to the fact that Europe has been an early mover in enforcement against large tech monopolies, and that is undisputed. I said it on my panel at ABA this morning. Oops, I mentioned the word. I mean, it's certainly the case that Europe in 2010 was doing things that were unimaginable in the US. And Europe was a pioneer. In this town, I did an event in 2019 saying, where is America? And then that's what I meant. I met Roger in 2019 when the big American transatlantic shifted towards enforcing against Google. That is undisputed. The reality, and you don't need to agree with me, is that it has delivered nothing. It has delivered nothing because the antitrust cases against Google, against Amazon, against Apple, against Microsoft, nothing has happened on the ground, which is why we're now pivoting to regulation, and that's another conversation. So that I wouldn't disagree with you. What I was referring to when I was talking about the way in which the framing is quite conventional still in Europe is really the way in which the lens over here has been, the aperture of that lens has broadened. So, and it's not just about, price, quality, innovation, and these narrow kind of categories, versions of consumer welfare. It's been in the last 5 years, certainly an attention to things like fairness, to things like worker rights, to things like how farmers are faring. So it's been a real re-examination of the entire framework. And I wanted to go to Roger now because, of course, this is something that struck me about the earlier panel. There was consensus both on the part of Gail and Andrew that much of this was not going to be rolled back, and the vision, the focus on America first, and indeed what it meant for workers, what it meant in terms of fairness, is going to be a driving force for this administration. Not, of course, the rolling back to a scalpel idea of antitrust that looks at a narrow problem and deals with it. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to say about the direction that we're headed, but I think that the theme that you're sensing is a very strong commitment to continuing with the cartel and monopoly abuse cases. There's so many cases out there that have been launched, and the strength of them is fairly obvious. And so I think the early signals that you can see from the first few months is there's a lot of continuity with respect to the conduct cases. I think on the merger side, that's the area where there could be, probably will be differences, specifically on the willingness to find some sort of consent decree solutions to mergers that may be pro-competitive if you can just fix a few pieces to the merger, and then with a consent decree, then you can move forward. Because otherwise, if you either have an attitude of we're going to sue everything, or it either has to be perfectly clean, or we're going to sue, then you really do bottleneck the deal making and the VC money and the promise and opportunity for an exit strategy. Exit strategy has to include not just IPOs, but also acquisitions. And so we have to send to the market the animal spirits are encouraged to bring the deals forward. And when you bring the deals forward, consult with your antitrust lawyers to try to make it as clean as possible. And if there's problems, then we negotiate those if at all possible and find structural relief or otherwise. So I do think that's right. There's a lot of continuity with Europe and with the previous administration on the conduct cases. And I think on the merger side, certainly early termination was almost non-existent in the Biden administration. We really, really want to say that if the merger is not problematic, why are we waiting so long to say that, right? I mean, early termination, especially given the anxiety of the merging parties, the A and B side, about the fact that there's a merger, you don't want there to be adverse consequences of a delay if it's a pro-competitive merger. So early termination and then, consent decrees, I think are going to be obvious examples of departures. Do you want me to say more on regulatory issues as well? So I do think, and I've heard Andreas speak for years, and I do really appreciate the new push toward more regulatory freedom. I know Europe really, really well. I've lived there for over 8 years in 4 different countries, and I've traveled back and forth when I was with the DOJ. I know it really, really well. And I would say that the analogy that I would give for Europe is the island of Lilliput, in which it's not the island of Lilliput, it's the continent of Lilliput, in which you have a giant that is basically unable to maneuver in the way that they want to maneuver because of 1,000 strings that are keeping them down. And so the real goal is to let I don't want to say sleeping giant, let the encumbered giant rise up by having a stronger deregulatory push. And if you look at the bureaucracy index, you can find these various indexes of business freedom, regulatory freedom, bureaucracy freedom. There's some bright spots in Europe for sure. Ireland, for example, is one. I think Sweden is one. But there are many, many countries where the startup costs are very, very significant. super simple example that I've been telling the Europeans for years is there's no safe harbor for GDPR. I mean, like small businesses, medium-sized businesses have to comply with GDPR in a way that's very, very burdensome. And it basically gives a playing field open for the bigger companies that have compliance. And so I think regulations that are anti-competitive and that are part of essentially lobbying efforts by giant corporations are a version of monopoly abuse that is protected under Norr-Pennington.
Well, I certainly believe that we cannot in Europe regulate ourselves out of the laggard position we're in. And this is what we've been doing for years as the regulator superpower. So that has now come to a stark relief. And as Andrea says, there is an initiative to simplify that. And you're right. But let me go and talk about the second vector of change, which I think you didn't quite agree, Andreas, that the Draghi mission was one that really had that much of an impact on what antitrust agencies should do. My view is that it should absolutely revolutionize the way in which things are done, because just again, my perception, maybe not in Germany, but in a lot of the agencies, is that there is a siloed thing. We don't know what what the macroeconomic piece is. We don't know what the financial piece is. We don't seem to know or care that is also in play. Let's talk about the second vector of change, which I think is so inescapable for the Europeans. So we've seen the speeches of Vice President Vance in Paris, and then we've seen Munich, and then there's been this incredible episode of the meeting in the Oval Office with Zelensky. And I can tell Americans in this room that that was a Sputnik moment for Europeans, a total Sputnik moment. It's like, where were you when there was the moon landing? Because I was watching it, and I knew all of Europe was watching it. And what we saw was the defenestration of Europe in a very dramatic sense. It was stark and clear. Europe was being thrown overboard. And that night I was kind of texting friends, and then we were like, what have we just watched in Paris, in Berlin? Interestingly, when I was texting friends in America, Democrats and Republicans responded, stop being crybabies. We are not going to come and get you out of trouble anymore. If you've got the bad man on the border who's going to walk across, it's your problem, not ours, and you need to solve it. And that realization has landed, I think, with a big thud in Europe. Serendipitous moment, there was the German election just that weekend. And the new president-elect has said just 48 hours later that he was finally lifting the debt brake and promising 1 trillion in investment in defense and infrastructure for Europe. And honestly, you could feel Europe just going the sigh of relief. Because if Germany is back, Europe is back. This is the reality on the ground. Germany is back, we stand a chance. So that is now the predominant mood, right? We've got to do stuff. We've got to do this sovereignty, this autonomy stuff by ourselves. It's the absolute driver. So you say, like, in merger control, this we need to continue to enforce, but is that affecting any way the thinking? So if there is now a merger of defense companies, for example, how do we think about that? Strategic sectors in Europe in which we have a problem of fragmentation, isn't that going to be a way in which, going forward, we need to take that into account? We don't like, national champions. Yeah, but we need European champions. What else are we going to do? There you are.
Ah, thank you. What a spectrum. I must start, Christina, by this constant reproach. You always made that in Brussels of that silo thinking of competition agencies. I mean, we are not political bodies, Christina. We are applying the law. It's as simple as that. And the room for maneuver is limited. And I'm happy that it is limited, because otherwise we would be political agencies, which we are not. So we are applying the law. We are changing practices from time to time, which is necessary. I think competition agencies have the task to keep up with the economy, which is sometimes moving fast. We have to develop new ideas. We have to try that in court. But especially before court, I made that experience time after time. The room for maneuver to develop new ideas, let's put it carefully, is limited. Let's put it this way. That's one point. The second point is, you cannot put everything on the shoulder of competition and competition agencies just because they are the only agencies that have something to do with the economy. You cannot solve all problems by applying competition law in this way or that way. You can help, you can support, you can facilitate. All this you can do, but you cannot really go for a change as a competition agency because you move in the framework of the given law. You know, if there's a good thing in what we see for the time being, I think it is that Europe has become aware that we must take our fate in our hands. And I think this is the good thing because, to be frank, this could be a great moment for Europe to say, let's do it. Let's do it with speed. Let us invest. If I look at Germany, let's look that we set up our infrastructure, physical or digital. Let's get sovereign. Let's see that we have our own European cloud. Let's do all these things in the best sense that lead to more competition with companies in the US, with companies abroad. And I think this could be a great moment to relieve Europe from lots of strings, as Roger has put it. And I hope that this spirit in the very end is prevailing in Europe. There is a sense to do that. You have seen that in Germany with the latest fiscal move that we have taken. 500 billion euros for the military sector. That's not bad, only for Germany. I'm a bit afraid this will not help this fragmentation of military equipment in Europe, because as a matter of fact, the Germans buy German, the Italians buy Italian, and the Czech buy Czech. And this leads to the fact where the US maybe has one system of weapons, or 3 or 2, at the most we have 30. But I'm not so sure that this will be helped by this kind of movement. What we see for the time being, what I see in my agency, we have many cross-border mergers in a sense that we see joint companies coming up, trying to develop new military equipment and make it available in several European states. For the time being, we act with these mergers quite well. We can do that without changing the law, because normally it has an effect beyond the borders, so it's not that significant with regard to competition. So I think for the time being we can handle it, we can deal with it, and I think the whole situation leads to the fact that the European military defense industry is moving closer together. And what I can say as of today, competition law does not stand in the way. If we need changes of the law, we will see. Sometimes you see these moves. We have just seen the abolishment of merger control in the hospital sector in Germany because policy wanted to go for more planification in this area. If this is a good thing or a bad thing, well, we will see. But this is happening if necessary, or if deemed necessary by the policymakers. So I think there is some hope that we really see kind of a spirit and a mood that Europe goes ahead, takes its fate in its own hand, and this is surely the good thing about it.
No, there's no question that the spirit, the vibe has changed dramatically in the last few weeks, and this may well turn out to be one of the positive effects. This idea that you need to take your fate in your hands. That said, and you know, the trillion investment that Germany has promised has completely galvanized Wall Street, and investment is moving back to Europe because there is an expectation of returns in that direction. That said, we are still in a moment of huge uncertainty because, of course, today in the Rose Garden, we will hear what the tariff situation is going to be for Europe. It's going to be a very important moment. And then there is going to be a response from Europeans and so on. And so in the earlier panel, Roger, Gail Slater was talking about how the trade peace and the way in which trade was being thought as putting Americans first was also very much part of the way she thinks about the mission of antitrust. And so this is something that really is marrying the antitrust view with the broader set of economics tools, which I very much agree with. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yes. So I teach antitrust. I teach international trade. I know the area as well. I'm extremely well versed in, and this really is a historic change that has happened since 2016. The tariff wars with China in the first administration, and then the continuation of tariffs in the Biden administration, and then the escalation of tariffs in the second Trump administration really is, I think, a sea change with respect to liberal economic values. And I think we should view that as a genuine, sincere concern by the Trump administration about the plight of the average American worker, and the need to really take those concerns seriously. And so it's an expression of economic populism. And I also, by the way, think that there are parts of the immigration story that are also very much connected to the economic plight of the working poor as well. And so I think that the antitrust focus, I think, also has to relentlessly focus on the concerns of the average American and where they're spending their money. And where are they spending their money? Housing, healthcare, insurance, transportation, food and groceries, entertainment. I mean, we really, really should be focused on those things to make sure that the average American worker sees it. And when we opened an investigation on eggs, it was like just a plummeting of the price from $8 to $3 in a matter of days. And I was like, wow, that tells you something. So there is a risk of antitrust response, anti-competitive behavior responding to the high tariffs, and that is dynamic pricing behavior of the remaining competitors. And so, you know, if there's high tariff walls for foreign competition, and then you go from only 3 competitors to 2 competitors, then you have dynamic pricing risk associated with that. And so we really need to be careful to watch for that when you do your market share calculations, when you do your analysis of anti-competitive conduct. We have to look to see if the tariffs will in any way, shape, or form impact that. When we saw that in the first administration with washers and dryers, that there was a change to the pricing behavior when LG was basically excluded from the market, and then LG very quickly ramped up their production in the United States. But that is a risk, and also, for that matter, how you count the number of market players in a situation with high tariffs. Great.
I'd like to move to the last segment of this discussion, which is inevitably digital, and indeed we have already talked about it in the previous panel. It was absolutely unambiguous, the commitment that both Gail and Andrew sort of made to enforcing against tech monopolists. That said, for anyone watching from Europe or seeing from Europe, the messages are occasionally mixed because, of course, there is a sense that the administration will be more transactional and may allow certain things and defends, in fact, tech giants vis-a-vis foreign authorities, foreign powers. What is your view, Roger, about what the enforcement effort that was started under the previous, well, in fact, under Trump 1 and then and continued under the Biden administration? Where is that going?
Well, I can just echo what Gail has already said publicly, and that is that there is an effort by some of these companies to say to this administration that you need to promote national champions in order to effectively compete against China. And she said that the best response to new innovative industries such as artificial intelligence is really vigorous, effective competition, not the creation of government-chosen national champions. That is not the answer. So what we really want is really effective competition, not to give a special blessing to a particular company that has, connections with someone in the administration.
And that suggests that the cases that are underway will proceed.
We want effective competition so they can compete better as well.
Mm-hmm. So let me turn to Andreas, and I know I always sound as if I am somewhat critical of what Europe does. In fact,
You always are.
well, for the better. But my other sort of line is also that I think that we are far from done. Europe is amazing, and it's an amazing continent, and we have amazing resources and companies and people, and so we will be fine. But that said, when it comes to digital enforcement, we know the arc of the narrative, the cases in antitrust, and then we pivoted to digital regulation, and that is early days. We know the sort of the story. We know that this is certainly not something that's been embedded in, and there is a learning process, there is a learning curve. But it's hard to resist the observation that it is moving slowly. It is a well-deserving effort, but it is not going to really materially change the landscape on the ground, give real opportunities for European digital businesses to power up. So much so that in this effort about strategic autonomy, the big voices are, we should do our own thing, we should do our own cloud, we should do our own stuff, we should do our own infrastructure, because waiting for the big giants to open the door is too hopeful. And now we are, frankly, dare I say it, but I say anything anyway, in a world in which, how much these DMA, DSA fines will be wrapped into a discussion around effectively tariffs going one way and the other. Is that really what's ahead? So I know this is a difficult thing to predict, and I don't anticipate we can respond to it, but where is digital regulation in Europe leading us, do you think?
Yeah, I'm very happy to sit here and that the Trump administration has not yet announced what is going to happen. So I can tell you I'm not going to answer this question because everything is mere speculation. We have no what is going to happen. I never solve a hypothetical case on the podium, and I will surely not solve this very difficult question on that podium. But what I can tell you with regard to the digital cases that are ongoing in Europe, which is not only the DMA, it's also Section 19A, lots of cases going on. I think that fits perfectly to what Roger has just said. Because in fact, and I continue to say that, we are not regulating US companies. That's not the point. That does not interest us where the company comes from. We regulate, so to say, super dominant companies, and not even talking about dominance. If you look at Section 19A, you don't even need dominance. It's not needed, but we have companies before our eyes that drive ecosystems. And what is so important is these ecosystems are needed by small and medium-sized company if they want to have successful business model. And I think this is what our work is mainly about, at least in Europe. It is not about divestment in a bigger style, as it might happen in the US. We will see. It's more about opening doors, opening markets, facilitate opportunities for these companies, make sure that they can enter the market, that they can display their business model in riding the dragon, so to say, as many small and medium-sized companies put it in Germany. What is going to happen maybe today or tomorrow, I would say we have all, as we are sitting here, even Roger probably, who might be the closest to this, we have no idea. I think we are very much on the same page. There are cases going on for example, in the Bundeskartellamt, that is exactly in line with what is happening at the FTC for the time being. And if I hear that the US agencies are going to continue these cases, I have lots of hope, I can say, that we continue our cooperation, also in a sense with regard to the digital economy, at least as far as we talk about the conduct of these companies, that we need to do something here. With regard to fines and how this is regarded, I do not want to mingle with that. As I said, I have no idea what is going to happen if this is part of anything we will see. But I think in assessing the general situation, that we have ecosystems before our eyes who set the rules for their competitors. I mean, also this tells you this can never ever lead to any competition if the dominant company sets the rules for the competitor. That is impossible. And this is our mission to a certain extent, that we care for that and that we provide opportunities to these companies. And here I do believe I heard from the bilaterals that I've had here in Washington so far, from what I know from the staff that is cooperating. I think here, at least as I sit here today, we are pretty much on the same page, and I'm quite optimistic that we continue the cooperation that we have had with the DOJ for decades. For decades. It's not only for the past years. It's been for decades. You know, there have been cases, just to mention it, merger cases, where we managed to sit in the same trustee in order to take care that the remedies that had been imposed on both sides of the Atlantic are enforced properly. That really went far. And even if I think of other mergers just 2 years ago where we had this close cooperation, I'm pretty optimistic that we can continue on that, also in the digital realm.
Roger, do you want to?
Well, I think Andreas Mund has a lot of capital in his bank account with respect to the argument that he is strongly committed to non-discriminatory enforcement of antitrust laws. You know, the United States and Europe worked extraordinarily closely in the last Trump administration on making sure that we set down principles and commitments for non-discriminatory enforcement of competition law. And we negotiated very, very strongly and united in non-discriminatory enforcement of that. And you got to the finish line in the competition, the cap arrangement, where the first article is on non-discriminatory enforcement. And we know that there are instances of discriminatory enforcement. In fact, my first OECD meeting in December of 2017 involved a remedy that was imposed on a US company for global licensing requirements to address the harms in one country. And we were all thinking, why don't you have a licensing regime for that country that can fix the problem in that country? And then if the company is able to have other licensing regimes for other countries, then that's the approach. And we were supported by many other countries in that argument. You remember this, I'm sure, Andreas. And so there's examples of discriminatory enforcement regimes that don't make sense. And so we will obviously look at that and address that. And so I think the European Commission is aligned on that as well.
So on this note, I know we need to close. We've come at time. I think please join me in thanking both Andreas and Roger for this discussion.